As a recap, most of you already know that Petscii Robots already had ports available for the PET, the VIC-20, the C64, the Apple II, the Atari 8-bit, and the Commander X16. But at the end of the last video, I mentioned some 6502-based systems that have yet to have a port. Well, I guess when I put it that way, a lot of people took it as a challenge, and about 100 people asked for the source code, and as usual, I never heard back from most of them. But there are now 7 actual ports in progress. And so what I want to do in this video is I want to show you some of those ports that are almost finished. And then I want to show you, some sneak peeks of the ones that are coming down the line. So here's the new Commodore 128 version, which I'm very excited about, but we'll come back to that in a moment. First, let's have a look at another port. Yep, this is the Commodore Plus 4. Sort of the red-headed stepchild of the Commodore family, and there isn't a lot of software made specifically for it. In fact, most of the software it has was really aimed at the Commodore 16, which the Plus 4 is compatible. But that means that most of the games are only using 16K of the Plus 4's total 64K. Of course, the Plus 4 is a pretty capable games machine. In fact, one of the best games on the system is a modern game called Pet's Rescue, which is a Super Mario style game. Well, let's find the disc. We have the C64, Apple II, Atari, Commodore 128, and here it is, Plus 4. So I'll just stick this in my 1551 disk drive, and all I need to do to start the game is press Shift and Run Stop on the keyboard, and there we go. So let's back up a bit. After showing the list of remaining computers, I was approached by Jim Wright to do a Plus 4 port, and so I sent him the source code and he got right to work. It wasn't long until he sent me a working version that was more or less working. It's based on the C64 port, which is sort of unusual since most of the other ports have come directly from the PET version. But the Plus 4 definitely has a few challenges that have to be considered. First of all, it has no hardware sprites. So if you look at the C64 version of the game, we're using sprites for a lot of things, including the player character and the weapons and items displays, as well as the cursor used to select objects on the map. So we'd have to find ways to replace that. The player character was essentially copied straight from the VIC-20 port that I had already done. It basically puts 7 characters on the screen that essentially never move, and then we just simply redefine those 7 characters every time the player character animates. Believe it or not, we had enough characters left over to assign 12 of them to the weapons display and 16 more to the items display. Again, these characters never actually move, but what we do is redefine the characters every time the object needs to change. This worked out pretty well, and while some things had to end up looking a little different from the C64, overall, I'd say it came out much to my satisfaction. Of course, I wanted the Plus 4 version to also support the user port adapter so we could play with the SNES controller, just like the other Commodore systems. I wrote this code myself, and it was quite a pain to get it working on the Plus 4. The main problem was a lack of documentation on how the I/O chip works in the Plus 4, and the user's manual doesn't actually explain any of it like most Commodore manuals do. On the bright side, I eventually got it working. Of course, the Commodore 64 version starts up with this intro screen made of Petscii characters, and the problem with the C64 version is the game uses up most of the RAM of the C64, and there just wasn't really enough RAM to do a nice bitmapped intro screen, at least not without having to load it from disk every time the game restarts. But you'll notice here on the Plus 4 we have a nice graphical intro screen. In fact, the little face changes on the robot with the difficulty level, just like the other versions. Now, I'm sure you're asking, how is it possible here but not on the C64? Well, the Plus 4 version is inherently smaller because it doesn't have the full SID musical score that the C64 version has. So when we add in the intro screen, it winds up about the same size as the C64 version. Of course, there is a very nice intro tune. I hired Noel, again, to create the intro tune and some of the other sounds on the system. There aren't a lot of trackers for the Plus 4, so we settled on one called Petscii. It actually runs on the Plus 4 itself, so Noel had to use the Plus 4 emulator to write the music. Petscii doesn't seem to support sound effects with music, but it does support 16 total songs. So what we decided to do was just use 3 songs for the intro screen and the win and lose scenarios for Game Over, and then the other 13 songs were essentially just short sound effects, so we could tell Petscii to play a song when a person opens a door or sets off an explosion, for example. It worked out really well, actually. The sounds actually remind me a bit of an Atari 2600. And it's probably for the best that we didn't have music in the game anyway, because with just 2 voices, and I'm not sure it would have sounded very good to mix in the sound effects. And since we have no in-game music, Jim added some little footstep sounds, which are kind of cool. I think this is the only version of the game that does this. So let's talk about some specs here. You can see I was using my 1551 disk drive, which is the best option for a Plus 4, of course, because it's fast. Of course, you can actually use just about any Commodore disk drive, such as a 1541, but it's going to take over twice as long to load. You can also load a digital copy from something like the SD2IC or a Pi 1541. The game does, of course, require 64K to work, so you can't run it on a stock C16, but if you upgrade the RAM in your C16 to 64K, then in theory it should work, except for the SNES controller because, well, the C16 doesn't have a user port. The actual gameplay of the Plus 4 version is almost identical to the C64 version, better in some ways, worse in others, but it does have one trick up its sleeve that the C64 version lacks. You can press the Help key to get an instant full-color on-screen map. Your location is shown with a blinking dot. Of course, this doesn't give a huge advantage as the user manual for all previous versions already had all the different maps in the back, but it is certainly convenient to have it on screen. But what does help some is by pressing another key, you can activate the robots on the map, and now you can see them all going about their business. And this is helpful when you just can't find that last robot you need to kill in order to complete the level. Speaking of maps, the Plus 4 has a tiny bit extra room on the disc, and so we could fit a couple of bonus maps. This one is called Bunker, and everything is basically below ground. It reminds me somewhat of a dungeon crawler game. Anyway, so the Plus 4 has 12 maps as compared to 10 for the C64. So a big thanks to Jim Wright for doing most of the work on this port. I can honestly say this is one of the best Plus 4 games ever made. Again, much like the Pet, there isn't a lot of competition because there weren't hardly any dedicated Plus 4 games ever made to begin with. Because the Plus 4 market is so small, I'm going to just be sharing the same box and manual with the C64. I'll just be putting a sticker over the side showing it's the Plus 4 version. It will come with a special insert with information specific to the Plus 4 version, and of course it will come with the same SNES adapter as the C64 version. If you already have the C64 version, then I'd encourage you to just buy the Lite version, which will come like this, which is just the manual and the floppy disk at half the price. Okay, so let's talk about the Commodore 128 version. Now, this won't be any surprise to Commodore users out there, but the Commodore 128 rarely got any actual game releases. Most of the game companies decided that they could just make a C64 version, and the 128 users could just run the 64 version by putting it into 64 mode. And I actually made the exact same decision when I originally wrote Petscii Robots, but Scott Robinson contacted me after the last video and wanted to do a dedicated 128 port.
At the end of the video, he shared a list of platforms that he'd like to see get a port of Petscii Robots, including the Plus 4 and BBC Micro and a few consoles. I couldn't believe he left out the Commodore 128. If ever there was an 8-bit computer that deserved a port, it was the 128 in my opinion.
So let's take a look at some of the extra features of the 128 that we ended up making use of. Obviously, we used the 128K of RAM, basically every last drop of it. We made use of the MMU for faster block copies. Of course, the 80-column screen, faster disk access, more space on the disks, auto boot, and full use of the 128's keyboard. So let's talk about some of these. We can start with the graphics. As you know, the C64 version of the game is based on character graphics. I have 256 characters, and I have to use them like puzzle pieces to build the various tiles in the game. Each tile consumes exactly 18 bytes of data. That's 9 bytes for the characters and 9 bytes for the color information. Moving to multicolor bitmap graphics means each tile can be drawn however we want, completely independent of the rest. There's no sharing of data between tiles. I hired a professional pixel artist to draw our tiles, since this is way beyond my capability. He's actually the same artist that did the monochrome tiles on the Apple II version, as well as the Amiga version that we'll talk about later. Clearly, the tiles look better this way, but it does mean that an individual tile now consumes 72 bytes of data, plus the same 9 bytes for color data for a total of 81 bytes. That means we need 4.5 times more storage for the data itself, but it also means it takes 4.5 times longer to copy the tile to the screen. In fact, I had written a little test program just to draw 4 test patterns on the screen over and over to see how long it would take, and I didn't think it would be fast enough. I think in this test I'm getting somewhere around 4 or 5 frames per second. But Scott convinced me that certain optimizations would make it possible, so I agreed to move forward. In fact, here's an early version of the tile engine working in the game, and you can see it is unbearably slow. Of course, even at this point, we knew there were several optimizations we could make use of to speed things up. The first thing was a clever use of the 128's MMU to speed up copying by about 30%. The next thing was to redesign the screen draw routine to only draw tiles that have changed, much like was done on the Apple II version. And so as you can see, it's working much faster now. Next, we removed the sprites that were used for weapons and items displays and converted those to bitmap graphics, and then redesigned the entire UI section of the game. And we had a little extra space, so I thought maybe we should add a little Doom guy face down by the health meter. And it works pretty much exactly like you'd expect. With each injury you receive, the face looks worse and worse until you either die or use the medkit to restore your health. We thought it would be cool if we could use the 80-column display on the 128 as a second display to display a map. Keep in mind the 128 actually has a separate video output on the back for the 80-column display, and it even has a separate video chip just for it, so there's no reason you can't use this as a dual monitor setup. So Scott and I brainstormed ideas for how to display a map like this on the 80-column chip. It was no easy task. This is an example of one of the maps in the game, and this is exactly how it appears in the user's manual. Now, the map is 128 wide by 64 tall. In order to display this, we need to be able to represent each tile with its own color. But normally speaking, the VDC can't do that. Looking at our options, we get a text display with about 80 by 25 characters and 16 colors. There's no way to really use this to display the full map. The second option would be to use the bitmap graphics, which is 640 by 200, but it's in 2-color monochrome. Still, this was my initial plan. For example, we could throw up a pre-rendered map, sort of like this treasure map. Granted, this is just an example image I found on Google and converted it to a compatible format. It doesn't match any of the maps in the game, obviously. But anyway, something like this would be totally doable, and then we could have a blinking dot showing where you are at any time. But then we came up with another idea. If we reduce the screen size down to 512 by 128 resolution, which the VDC will totally allow you to do, then you can free up enough RAM to get 16 colors. And we picked this resolution specifically because it is evenly divisible by the dimensions of our map. Now, the trouble is you still can't place any color anywhere you want. Much like the Commodore 64, you still have color cells where you can only put 2 colors in an 8x8 cell. Fortunately, the VDC will let you change the shape of the color cells, so we set it down to 8x2. And with this, we can fill one side of the cell with pixels. This way, your 2 colors, foreground and background, can be independently controlled. And thus, we're calling this chunky pixel mode, where a single chunky pixel is 4x2 pixels. But the great part is there are no color limitations. And as you can see, our map on the second display has come to life. The blinking dot is the player character. And if you want to see the robots, you can press Shift-Tab, and now you can see them all going about their business. So what if you don't have a spare RGBI monitor to connect to your Commodore 128? No problem. The 128 has a composite output located on one of the spare pins on the RGBI connector. You just need an appropriate cable, like this, to get a composite output. In fact, you could build your own. It's not that complicated. The trouble is, the composite output is monochrome. Now, I think it was intended to be used with a nice sharp monochrome monitor like this one, and as you can see, the 80-column text is super sharp and clear. In fact, you can even run GEOS 128 on here, and it works perfect for that. But there's a big problem. So here's the colors you'd normally get on a color monitor, and you'd think converting to monochrome would look something like this, but it isn't. Instead, the VDC only outputs black, white, and a single shade of gray. That means a lot of the things on the map become indistinguishable on a monochrome monitor. So to help with this, we added a feature where you could use the tab key to toggle to a monochrome map, which is designed specifically to use just the 3 shades. And it's totally usable. So for example, if you just had 2 matching color TVs, you could totally use this as your dual monitor setup, keeping in mind that the map would be in monochrome. I recently took a C128 with me to the DFW Retro Computer meetup, and lots of people came by to see and play Petscii Robots, including these 2 kids that played it literally for hours. I think a lot of people were shocked about the dual monitor setup. Many people asked me what sort of modification I did to the 128 to allow this to work, and they were quite surprised when I explained that it was a stock system with no modifications. Okay, so let's talk specs for a moment. What will you need to run this game? Well, the good news is any stock Commodore 128 will work. It should work with PAL or NTSC, but you will need a 1571 or 1581 disk drive. The game will be distributed on both kinds of disks, but the standard 1541 and similar Commodore disk drives are not supported. The game does auto boot, so you can just stick the disk in and press reset, and you're good to go. Here's a feature that might be a first, though. Let's say you want to load from your 1581, but it's configured as drive 9. Well, just type in boot U9 in BASIC and your Commodore 128 will boot straight from that drive, no problem. You can also load the game from an SD to IC, but I've noticed the load times are very slow since it doesn't fully emulate the burst mode of the 1571 or 1581. The second monitor, of course, is optional and not required for gameplay. Also, by popular demand, we now have 1541 support. So the digital download will include 2 disk images for side A and side B, and the program will let you know when to insert the other side. However, you'll have to make these yourself as I will not be duplicating these for the physical distribution. The 128 version will ship with its own box and manual, which I can show you here on screen, but I'm still waiting on these from the print shop. One other little feature of the 128 is the ability to change your character's color. As you can see, sometimes he blends into the background, so you can press F8 to cycle through different color schemes. This one here we call Mr. Spock. Overall, I'm really thrilled with the 128 port. Scott did some amazing work on the code, and this experience has totally changed my mind on the C128 when it comes to the question of whether or not it brings anything to the table for games over a C64. The answer is definitely yes. And the C128 version is currently the best version of Petscii Robots for any of the 8-bit computers. So I've shown you the Plus 4 version and the C128 version. Both of these are actually complete and for sale immediately on the website, but there are a number of ports that are still in progress, and I'm going to give you a sneak peek of the rest, including the Commodore Amiga, Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and the Atari 7800. There are actually more ports than this in progress, but these are the ones that have reached a stage where they're at least somewhat playable, and I feel I have something to show you. Let's start with the Amiga version. This version is being developed by Vesa Hultunen, and it should be no surprise that the game looks and sounds better on the Amiga since it is a 16-bit platform. The target system is a stock Amiga 500. The graphics are mostly finished. There are a number of mismatched tiles that need to be fixed. The desk here is a perfect example. The artwork was done by the same artist that did the C128 artwork as mentioned earlier. The music is completely finished. Noel also composed the soundtrack for this version in the form of a 4-channel mod file. And as you can see, we adopted the same look as the C128 version with the UI and the little face at the bottom. And one feature the Amiga version supports that so far no other ports have is the fact that whatever weapon you're carrying at the time is reflected in the little character on the map. The Amiga version is probably the closest to being finished of the remaining ports, and I'll definitely follow up with another video about development of this version. But for the moment, let's move along to the NES version. Now, many of you have seen this already as I gave a sneak peek of it in the last video about it. This version is being developed by Vile Owl, and the musical score was also done, once again, by Noel Aman, and a lot of people will immediately notice the game is being presented mostly in grayscale. Now, much like the Atari version, this is a result of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The NES color system isn't a good match for the design of Petscii Robots, but what it lacks in color, I'm hoping it will make up for with the awesome soundtrack. Again, I'll cover this in more detail in a future video. Next, let's have a look at the Super Nintendo version. This version is being done by Govak Lamesi, and by the way, I'm showing this in order of most complete to least complete, so as we go down the line here, each version will look a little less complete. Anyway, the SNES version has no sound at all yet. It's using the same graphics assets as the Amiga versions, and thus everything should look pretty similar. One funny thing is that so many of these ports have been using an SNES controller already, and finally we're getting a version that runs natively on the machine the controller was designed for. Okay, let's have a look at the Atari 7800 version. This is being done by 2 guys, Matthew and Mike. And don't worry too much about how this looks at the moment. I mean, I understand they're working on a new graphics engine. After all, the Amiga version looked very much like this in its early days of development, and clearly it looks a lot better now. But at least they have it to a point where it is playable, and that alone is quite an accomplishment. So we'll come back and revisit this in the future. And the last version I'm going to show you is the Sega Genesis version. This version is being done by Augusto Santos. This version is barely playable at this stage, but it is working. You'll notice the graphics and artwork are totally different as somebody else is working on that. So the Genesis version will have a style of its own. Also, I'd like to remind people to visit the Attack of the Petscii Robots Facebook group. I post all the latest development news on the various ports here, and I get a lot of feedback from people on how things should look or work from this group. In the next episode, I'll dive in a bit deeper on the Amiga and Nintendo ports, both of which should be closer to complete by that point. But that wraps it up for this episode. As always, thanks for watching.